A mother was kicked out for a younger woman, but when she uncovers a hidden fortune, her ex-husband's regret comes too late. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Catherine stood by the kitchen window, watching the rain trickle down the glass. The familiar sounds of her home, her children laughing in the other room, the clinking of dishes in the sink, seemed distant now. Her husband, David, had grown cold, distant, and often disappeared on business trips that stretched for days. Tonight, as the clock ticked past midnight, she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her chest. Something was wrong. David's recent change in behavior had been gradual but undeniable. The affectionate man she once knew had slowly become a ghost in their home, showing no signs of the warmth they used to share. He was spending more time away, and when he was home, the silence between them was deafening. Catherine's world crashed down that evening when David walked into the house, his face devoid of emotion. She could tell something was coming before he even opened his mouth. "We need to talk," David said, his voice clipped. He dropped his suitcase at the door and crossed the room. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest. She had dreaded these words, but hearing them now, they felt like daggers. "I don't want to drag this out," he continued, looking anywhere but at her. "I've met someone else." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Catherine felt her knees wobble, but she gripped the edge of the counter, steadying herself. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm leaving you. I've been seeing someone for months now," David said, as if it were the most casual thing in the world. "I've moved in with her. You'll need to leave the house by the end of the week." Catherine blinked, her mind spinning. Leave the house. The home she had poured every ounce of herself into for the past 15 years. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "The kids, what about them?" she asked, her voice cracking. "They're old enough to understand. I'll explain everything to them," David said coldly. "They'll stay with me." The finality of it all was paralyzing. Catherine had built her entire life around this home, around David and their children. Now she was being cast aside like an unwanted object. She tried to argue, to plead, but David was unmoved. By the end of the week, Catherine found herself standing on the porch with 2 suitcases, her world shattered. She had nowhere to go. David had taken everything from her. The house, the children, the life she thought was hers. Now she was alone. Catherine took the bus to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, her mind in a daze. She couldn't believe that this was her life now. A life without David, without her children, without a home. Days blurred into weeks, and the shock slowly gave way to a quiet despair. Catherine struggled to find her footing. She hadn't worked in over a decade, not since she had chosen to stay home and raise their 2 children, giving up her career for the sake of their family. Now she was left with no money, no job, and no direction. The small savings she had scraped together were running out fast. Catherine found herself picking up odd jobs just to survive. She cleaned houses, worked at a local diner, and even did laundry for people in the neighborhood. It was a humbling experience, one she never imagined would be her reality. Late one night, as she sat on the creaky motel bed, a flood of memories rushed through her. Her mind drifted to her father, a proud businessman who had run a successful company before his untimely death. She had been so young when he passed, and much of his business dealings had been handled by lawyers and accountants. Catherine had always assumed that everything had been settled years ago, but a gnawing feeling grew in her chest. There was something her father used to say, a phrase he repeated during their rare father-daughter talks. "Always keep your eye on the paperwork, Katie. You never know what might be hidden between the lines." Catherine hadn't thought much of it back then, but now, in her moment of desperation, those words seemed to take on new meaning. Driven by nothing more than a vague memory and the need to find some semblance of hope, Catherine went to the storage facility where her father's belongings had been kept for years. The storage unit was musty, filled with boxes of old documents, family heirlooms, and other forgotten relics from her childhood. She spent hours sifting through the stacks of papers, feeling increasingly foolish. What was she even looking for? But just as she was about to give up, A folder caught her eye. It was marked with her father's company logo, the faded ink barely visible. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, she found a contract dated 25 years ago. It was an agreement between her father and a large corporation, one of the biggest in the country. Her father had been a minority shareholder in the company, and as part of the deal, his shares had been placed in a trust. The trust was set to mature next month. Catherine stared at the document in disbelief. If she was reading it correctly, she was the sole beneficiary of that trust. The value of the shares had likely grown exponentially over the years, given the success of the corporation. This couldn't be real, could it? Could her father have left her a fortune, hidden away in a trust she had never known about? And if so, why hadn't anyone told her? She clutched the papers tightly, her heart racing. For the first time in weeks, Catherine felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. This is the opening to the story, setting up Catherine's downfall and hinting at the discovery of her hidden wealth. We can continue with the next part, where she investigates further and faces new challenges as she tries to claim what is rightfully hers. Does this tone and pacing work for you so far? Catherine barely slept that night, her mind racing with the implications of the discovery. If the contract was real, and if she was indeed the beneficiary of the trust, it could change everything. She could finally break free from the suffocating grip of poverty, and most importantly, reclaim control over her life. The next morning, Catherine set out to confirm the validity of the contract. With no connections to powerful lawyers or business contacts anymore, she visited a small law firm in town. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Rebecca Evans, welcomed Catherine with a warm yet skeptical smile as she laid the yellowing contract on the desk. "I'm not sure what to make of this," Catherine began, her voice trembling slightly. "But if it's legitimate, I think I might be the beneficiary of a substantial trust." Rebecca's eyes flickered with curiosity as she scanned the document. "Let's take a look," she said calmly, slipping on her reading glasses. For several agonizing minutes, Rebecca flipped through the papers, occasionally raising an eyebrow but saying nothing. Finally, she looked up, her face unreadable. "Well," she started, "this is quite a find. It seems your father did, in fact, set up a trust. If I'm reading this correctly, it matured just recently, meaning you are entitled to access it. Now, before we get too excited, we'll need to confirm its existence with the financial institutions involved and ensure there haven't been any legal challenges over the years." Catherine's heart leapt, but Rebecca's words kept her grounded. "How long will that take?" she asked, her voice barely masking her eagerness. "A few days, maybe a week," Rebecca said. "I'll need to contact the relevant parties and verify everything. But if it's all above board, you could be looking at a significant sum of money." Catherine nodded, her mind swirling with possibilities. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. The waiting was unbearable. Days passed in a blur of anxiety and hope, with Catherine oscillating between imagining a future filled with opportunity and dreading the possibility that it could all fall apart. She busied herself with small tasks to keep her mind off the uncertainty, but nothing could truly shake the restless anticipation that gnawed at her. One morning, just as Catherine was about to head out for a cleaning job, her phone rang. It was Rebecca. "Catherine, I've confirmed the trust," Rebecca said, her voice steady. "It's legitimate. The shares have been held under your name all these years, and given the current value of the corporation, you're looking at a substantial amount. Millions." The word echoed in Catherine's mind, millions. She felt her knees buckle, and she had to sit down. This was it. The moment she had hoped for but never truly believed would come. "There's just one complication," Rebecca continued, her tone darkening. "It seems that someone else has been trying to access the trust as well. I don't have all the details yet, but there have been recent inquiries about it." Catherine's pulse quickened. Who? Who would try to access it? "I don't know yet," Rebecca said. "But I'm working on it. My advice is to lay low for now. Whoever it is may be watching the situation closely, and we don't want to tip them off that you're onto it." Catherine's head spun. Who could be after her father's trust? And why now, after all these years? She couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. Her mind immediately went to David. Could he have known about this all along? Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Catherine began digging into her father's old business dealings. She spent hours at the library, poring over newspaper archives and corporate records. What she found was both shocking and heartbreaking. Her father's company had been involved in a hostile takeover just a year before his death. The corporation he had partnered with, the very one holding the trust, had used ruthless tactics to force her father out of his own business. The stress had likely contributed to his untimely death. And the more Catherine researched, the more she found connections that hinted at someone close to her family being involved in the betrayal. David. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. David had worked for that very corporation for years. Could it be possible that he had known about the trust all along? Had he been manipulating her? Biding his time, waiting for the moment when he could cast her aside and claim what should have been hers? Catherine's stomach churned at the thought. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made her feel sick. But she needed proof. Fueled by anger and determination, Catherine decided to confront David. She drove to his new home, the one he shared with the woman he had left her for. It was a sleek, modern house, a far cry from the modest home they had shared during their marriage. David opened the door, his expression shifting from surprise to smug amusement. "Catherine," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "what brings you here?" "I know about the trust," Catherine said, her voice steely. David's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, and what exactly do you think you know?" "I know you've been trying to access it," she said, stepping closer, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "I know you've been working for that corporation all these years, and I know you were involved in what happened to my father." David's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "Your father was a fool. He never knew how to handle business, and it's not my fault if his poor decisions caught up with him." Catherine's hands clenched into fists. "You knew about the trust. You married me because of it, didn't you? You stayed with me all these years, waiting for the moment you could throw me out and take what my father left me." David's silence was all the confirmation she needed. Catherine didn't wait for his response. Her heart raced, but her mind was clear. She had the upper hand now. Over the next few days, with Rebecca's help, Catherine moved quickly to secure her claim to the trust. She had anticipated David's next move, and when he tried to file paperwork to gain control of the shares, she was ready. Armed with the original contract and evidence of David's involvement in her father's downfall, Catherine blocked his attempts. In the end, it wasn't just the money she gained. It was her freedom. David had underestimated her, assuming she would remain the same passive wife he had discarded. But Catherine had grown stronger, more determined than ever to reclaim what was rightfully hers. As the dust settled and Catherine stood outside her father's old office building, now a symbol of her victory, she smiled for the first time in months. She had been kicked out, left with nothing, but in the end, she had found something far more valuable than money: her own strength. Catherine knew that securing the trust wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. She could feel David's presence looming over her victory like a storm cloud, waiting to strike back. And sure enough, just a week after blocking his initial attempts to access the trust, she received the official court summons. David had filed a lawsuit, claiming that Catherine was not entitled to the full trust. He argued that as her husband, he had contributed to her father's estate during their marriage, and thus had a right to a portion of the wealth. Catherine's anger flared. After everything he had done to her, throwing her out, lying and attempting to steal her inheritance, he now wanted more. Sitting in Rebecca's office, Catherine felt the weight of the legal documents in her hands. "He won't stop, will he?" she asked, feeling a surge of anxiety. "He'll keep trying to take this from me." Rebecca looked at her with calm determination. "He can try, but we have the law on our side. What we need to do is stay strong, present the evidence clearly, and show the court that you are the rightful owner of the trust." Catherine nodded, But inside she felt the familiar pang of fear. David was powerful, connected, and ruthless. He would stop at nothing to tear her down. But this time, she wasn't the same woman who had stood meekly by while he destroyed her life. This time she was ready to fight. The courtroom was cold and imposing. Catherine sat at the plaintiff's table beside Rebecca, her hands gripping the edge of the table as David strutted into the room, his lawyer by his side. He didn't even glance at her, but Catherine could feel the arrogance radiating off him. He was confident he would win, just as he had always won in their relationship. The trial was tense, with both sides presenting their arguments. David's lawyer claimed that Catherine's father had been a poor businessman, and that it was David's influence during the marriage that had kept the family afloat. He argued that David had an implied right to the trust, having supported Catherine financially for years. But Rebecca was relentless. She produced documents showing that David had no legal claim to the trust, and she carefully laid out the timeline of events, proving that David had been aware of the trust all along. As the proceedings continued, Rebecca revealed the most damning piece of evidence: David's involvement in her father's business collapse. Catherine had uncovered a series of emails from years ago, emails between David and executives at the corporation, discussing the takeover of her father's company. David had been working with them, feeding them information about her father's weaknesses in exchange for a high-ranking position within the company. He had betrayed not only Catherine but her father as well, long before her father's death. The courtroom gasped as the emails were presented. David's lawyer tried to object, but the damage had been done. Catherine could see the color drain from David's face as the judge took in the evidence. His confidence evaporated, replaced by a cold fury. The judge ruled in Catherine's favor. The trust was hers, and David was barred from accessing any of it. As the courtroom emptied, Catherine felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but it was tinged with sorrow. David had been part of her life for so long, and now, seeing him defeated, she didn't feel the triumph she had expected. Instead, she felt the weight of the years they had spent together, the family they had built, and the betrayal that had torn it all apart. Later that day, Catherine returned to her modest apartment, where the echoes of her old life still clung to the walls. She sat down, looking at the bank statement Rebecca had given her. Millions of dollars now in her name. She could buy a new home, reclaim her life, and live in comfort. But somehow, the money didn't bring the joy she thought it would. Her thoughts drifted to her children. David had poisoned their relationship, making them believe that she was the one at fault for the family's unraveling. Since the separation, her children had been distant, siding with their father. Now, with the truth exposed, she longed for a chance to reconnect with them. But that path was uncertain, and it would take time to heal the wounds David had caused. Catherine picked up the phone, her fingers hovering over the screen as she debated calling her daughter, Rachel. She hadn't spoken to her in weeks, not since the divorce papers had been finalized. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number. "Hello." Rachel's voice was cautious on the other end. "Rachel, it's Mom," Catherine said softly. "I know things have been hard, and I haven't been the mother you needed, but I want you to know the truth. I want to talk if you're willing." There was a long pause, and Catherine held her breath. I'll think about it," Rachel finally said, her voice softening just slightly. "Maybe we can talk." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Catherine smiled through her tears, knowing that rebuilding her family would take time, but it was a challenge she was ready to face. With the trust secured and David out of her life for good, Catherine made plans for her future. But instead of buying a mansion or living a life of luxury, she decided to use her wealth for something more meaningful. Catherine had seen firsthand how vulnerable women like herself could be left with nothing after years of sacrifice. She wanted to help others avoid the same fate. Catherine used a portion of her inheritance to start a foundation that provided legal and financial support to women going through divorce or struggling after being abandoned by their spouses. She named the foundation after her father, honoring his legacy and the values he had instilled in her. Through her work, Catherine found a renewed sense of purpose. She had been broken, betrayed, and left for dead by the man she once loved. But now, she had risen from the ashes, stronger than ever before. The money had given her freedom, but it was her inner strength, her resilience, that had truly transformed her life. As the foundation grew, so did her relationships. Slowly but surely, Catherine rebuilt her connection with her children. Rachel and her younger brother, Ethan, began to see the truth of what had happened, and they opened their hearts to their mother once again. One evening, as Catherine sat in her newly purchased home, a modest, cozy place that suited her perfectly, she looked out at the sunset and reflected on how far she had come. She wasn't the woman who had been cast out with nothing anymore. She was a survivor, a fighter, and most importantly, a mother who had regained everything she had lost, and more. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.